Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Thomas Williams about Jon Duns Scotus and his views of free will.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Thomas Williams, who's the Isabel A. and Henry D. Martin Professor of Medieval Philosophy at Georgetown University. Thomas has published widely on medieval philosophy and theology, with a particular focus on many of the figures that we've talked about on this season of the podcast, including Augustine, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas, and Jon Duns Scotus. Thomas has translated and edited several works from this period, but since our focus today will be on Jon Duns Scotus, I wanted to highlight a book that he translated and edited called Jon Duns Scotus Selected Writings on Ethics, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And for listeners who are interested in, Duns Scotus on free will in particular, Thomas has also written a chapter on him in the Routledge Companion to Free Will, and we'll refer to that in our conversation today. Well, welcome to the show, Thomas. Thanks for joining us. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on, these figures in medieval philosophy, but also the topic of free will in particular?
Thanks. It's good to be with you. I started being interested in philosophy generally out of questions arising out of my Christian faith, which I think happens to a lot of people. In a lot of cases, it leads people away from the Christian faith. It didn't do that for me, despite the worries of my teachers in my very conservative evangelical high school. And clearly one of the questions for Christians is how God could be right to hold us accountable for the things that we do, to judge us in particular when we do wrong. And before I even knew there was such a thing as incompatibilism or libertarian, I was sort of a naturally incompatibilist libertarian thinker about these things. And so because that was an important question for me anyway, with its analog, obviously, in the secular world, how am I right to hold other people accountable? How am I right to praise or blame? How does any of that make any sense? It has always been my conviction that those practices make no sense if determinism is true, whether it's causal determinism or theological determinism. And I don't remember a time that I was interested in philosophy and not interested in questions about free will. So that's going back a very long ways. And I started working on the medievals. Sorry, I'm just thinking about the fact that my PhD is how old now? 30 plus years. And of course, I started doing philosophy. Ronald Reagan was still president. It's been a long time. So finishing out his first term, actually. I've been at this for quite a while. I got interested in the medievals because it seemed to me, were the ones who dealt with the kinds of questions that interested me in philosophy most thoroughly and rigorously. And so I naturally gravitated to them, and they hooked me, and I've kept working on them, which is not to say I don't read contemporary stuff, and maybe I'll have the chance to reference some more recent than 1308. But I love the medievals. And then there's the question of, how did I get working on Scotus? And as often is the case with me, there is no good philosophical reason for my getting started working on Scotus, I should say. There are good philosophical reasons for keeping it up once I started. But the reason I ended up writing my dissertation on Scotus was that Eleanor Stump suggested that I do so. Right? Here's this interesting topic, but nobody's talked about it in Scotus. Why don't you do Scotus? And I thought, okay, well, if Eleanor says, then clearly that's the thing to do. And he kind of hooked me, and I spent the earliest parts of my career writing a lot about Scotus, particularly on ethics and moral psychology. Got away from him for quite a long while, have been kind of coming back to him. I'm in the middle of writing a book on a shamefully overdue book, but a book on Scotus's ethics. So that's kind of where I am now. I've come back to him, and it's a good time to come back to him because when I started working on him back in the early 90s, the texts were just a huge mess. And now pretty much everything has been critically edited. We have it all in front of us. There are a lot of shortcuts, so to speak, available that weren't available when I started working on him. And it really is time for somebody to write this book, and it might as well be me because I don't think anybody else really wants to.
Yeah. Very interesting. Probably some of our listeners have heard of Scotus. In fact, he was mentioned in our previous episode. But could you start by giving us a bit of historical context for the discussion? When did he live? What philosophers was he influenced by? What are some of his most widely read texts? Any other background that you think might be helpful?
Not only have you caught me in the middle of writing a book on Scotus's ethics, you've also caught me in the middle of revising my Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Scotus. So I generally have a really terrible memory, which is a great hindrance as a historian of philosophy. But right now, all this stuff is at my mental fingertips. So if I end up telling you more than any normal person really needs to know, you can just edit that stuff out. So Scotus, you rightly called him Jon Duns Scotus. So John is his given name or his baptismal name. Duns is his family name, also the name of the village in which he was born. It's in the Scottish borders, just over the border from England. And then Scotus identifies him as a Scot. So Jon Duns the Scot. We have fairly scanty information about his life. So a lot of what we say about him rests on inference. I almost was going to say guesswork, but that would be unkind. We have enough evidence that we can piece together some likely stories. We don't know when he was born, but it was probably 1263, 1264. He would have been sort of sent to the Franciscans fairly early in his life. So he was a Franciscan, and that's an important part of who he was as a theologian, probably around the age of 15, but it could have been earlier. And he went through the Franciscan educational system, about which we do know a fair bit. And when I say we, I really mean Stephen Dumont at Notre Dame, whom I just rely on for this kind of. And so we can piece together from what we know about that, where he would have been and what he would have been doing at various points in his career, so that we know, for example, that he would have been in Paris, at the University of Paris, for a few years at one point. He certainly worked at Oxford. He lectured on the sentences of Peter Lombard at Oxford. Lecturing on the sentences was roughly analogous to our idea of writing your dissertation. It was one of the final steps before you finished your education. He did that in 1298, 1299. We can be fairly certain. And then we know that he ended up at the University of Paris, which was the place to end up. I mean, Oxford was good, but Paris was really good. Everybody who was anybody ended up at Paris at some point. And in the end, he became what was called Regent Master, which is the Franciscan chair of theology at the University of Paris. And there he continued an illustrious career. Before that, he had given more lectures on the sentences. So we have 3 different sets of lectures, none of them complete, unfortunately. And after his regency in Paris, he was sent to the Franciscan studium in Cologne. Very, very normal thing for the Franciscans to move their star theologians around. He would have got there 1307, died unfortunately in 1308 on November 8th, one of the few definite days we have. So we can't even pin down the year of his birth, but we know the very day of his death. So that's a very quick summation of his life. There's a sarcophagus in the Franciscan church in Cologne that, of course, holds his bones, that has a motto on it that translates, I think I'll get this right, to Scotland bore me, England received me, France taught me, Cologne holds me. If I were an Oxford grad, I would be very peeved that England merely received him, but Paris taught him. But I'm not an Oxford grad, so I suppose I can take that in stride. So already within his lifetime, he was known for the subtlety of his thought. We see that in the letter that appoints him basically for promotion to master at Paris. And he's become known as the subtle doctor. All the medievals have an honorific like that. He's known also as the Marian doctor because of his defense of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Mm-hmm. He was influenced by a number of his Franciscan predecessors, including some people that you wouldn't have heard of, but certainly he recognizably has a kind of Franciscan temperament in his philosophizing. So where the Dominicans tend to emphasize intellect, the Franciscans tend to emphasize love and will, and that's very much a feature of Scotus's thinking. And you might say he sort of takes it to 11 compared to some of his Franciscan predecessors. And he's influenced in a reactive way by Thomas Aquinas to a certain degree. I mean, Thomas Aquinas was not as big a deal in the 13th century as he is now. He was a big-ish deal, mostly to annoy Franciscans. Henry of Ghent, who was, in the quaint phrase, secular master, meaning he wasn't a member of a religious order. So he was a priest, but not a Franciscan or a Dominican or what have you. Scotus reads a lot of Henry, mostly in order to get annoyed so that he can then think creatively about all the stuff that Henry got wrong. So he's all of it's something we sort of forget about or don't think about with the medievals, because they have this reputation as being kind of hidebound and deferential to authorities. And the word authority, auctoritas, does get used a lot. But an authority doesn't mean somebody you have to agree with. It means a big name in the field. So in the same way that if we want to publish a journal article, we have to, deal with the literature, as the referees will say. They also had to deal with the literature. They had to read the authorities and come to terms with those arguments. And Scotus was a very careful reader, generally. I mean, don't believe anything he says about Henry, because he read Henry out of spite, not to be informed. Another, and this will become relevant, another figure, though, that he is influenced by, and this is a bit unusual, though certainly not unique, is Anselm. So Anselm, I'll put it this way. If you're in the 13th or 14th century and somebody is saying nice things about Anselm, you were reading a Franciscan. Such afterlife as he had, such influence as he had, was confined almost entirely to the Franciscans. But Scotus is unusual even among the Franciscans for having read Anselm very carefully and thought very carefully about what he could take and what he couldn't quite take from Anselm. He even takes the ontological argument and refurbishes it to his satisfaction in a time where most people looked at the ontological argument and thought, well, this is obviously stupid. So Anselm would be another important influence, and that will certainly come up if we get to the two affections of the will.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So we've already talked a little bit about Scotus and Thomas Aquinas. Scotus's account of freedom is developed as an alternative to Thomas Aquinas's. So maybe it's worth here kind of giving a brief summary of Aquinas's view before we turn to Scotus's. Could you explain Aquinas's conception of the will and how he accounts for the will's freedom?
Everything I'm about to say is controversial to some degree. But you're interviewing me, so you're going to get my thoughts, and then you can have other people correct them. One of the reasons that it might be controversial is that everybody wants Aquinas to be a libertarian. And the reason they want that is, in my view, libertarianism is true. And of course, you want your favorite philosopher to have true views. But in my view, at least, and certainly in Scotus's view, Aquinas is just not a libertarian, as nice as it would be for him to be one. So here are two things that I think tell against Aquinas's being a libertarian, both of which are important for Scotus to sort of react against. One of them is the idea, which is common among the Dominicans generally, but very clear in Aquinas, the idea that freedom is ultimately rooted in the intellect and not in the will. So what Aquinas says, kind of stripped of the medieval jargon, is the will is what is free, but the intellect is why it's free. That is, ultimately, it's not because we have a power to choose that we're free. It's because we have the power to think about the potential objects of choice in different ways, so that I can regard one and the same activity, for example, one and the same possible courses of action in different ways. And if I regard it in one way, it will be good and worthy of choice. And if I regard it in another way, it will be not good and worthy of refusal or rejection. So, standard example, suppose, as I say this, actually, I'm looking out at a lake and thinking, one thing I could do after we're done with this interview is I could get the kayak out and just kind of paddle around the lake. That sounds like a really good thing to do. Why would that be good? Well, because it would be exercise and it would be healthful. And I live in Florida and I can do that sort of thing on December 1st and it will be comfortable and lovely and I can feel glad about my life choices. On the other hand, though, I can think about that as a shameful escape from the pressing burdens of writing about Scotus, which are certainly pressing, if burdensome. And so, depending on how I construe that possible course of action, right, I can either choose it or not choose it. But it's down to the way I think about it. It's ultimately not up to the will. So, again, in my view, which some people disagree with, I don't know why, because I don't see how Aquinas could be any clearer and more explicit about this. But anyway, in my view, there is nothing more to the will on Aquinas' view than its being, so to speak, the appetitive arm of the intellectual soul. So the real work governing human action gets done by the way we think about things. And then the intellect sort of passes that along to the will, which chooses accordingly. There is no, and here I'm quoting Jeff Hawes, a really good essay called Aquinas Among the Voluntarists, where he says, and I think this is the exact wording, the will has no independent power to shape human activity. So you might say, well, sure, I can think about getting out on the kayak either favorably or unfavorably, but I can choose how I think. Isn't that the will, right? Rather than the intellect, to which the proper Thomist, I think, should say, yeah, but I can only choose to think differently if my intellect tells me it would be a good idea to think differently. Mm-hmm. So the buck stops with the intellect. Okay, that's point one about Aquinas in my view. The corresponding point in Scotus, in line with the Franciscans generally, is no. It's not about how we think about things. We can think about things however we like. I can think about kayaking as good or bad or indifferent or somewhere in between, and I can choose it anyway. I can think about it as a shameful escape from pressing duties and choose it anyway, because what the heck? That's what freedom is all about. And that's not because of anything about how I think, it's because of how I choose. So that freedom ultimately resides in the will for Scotus. Again, in keeping with a lot of Franciscans, he's just super emphatic about it and takes it, you might argue, to extremes. There'd be a point where we can talk about some contemporary work if we get to that. So that's point number one, the idea that for Aquinas, freedom is ultimately rooted in how we think. For Scotus, it's ultimately rooted in our capacity to choose. Here's the second one, and it goes with the first one. For Aquinas, again, as I read him, the reason we have alternative possibilities over time, or alternative possibilities available for choice, is precisely that our thinking can go in different directions over time. So we have, to use modern jargon, diachronic freedom. So how is it that I am now free with respect to a decision whether I get out on the lake or not? Well, because there's no guaranteed outcome to my thought before I engage in my deliberation. So over time, I can think, well, this will contribute to my happiness or that will contribute to my happiness. Right. But at the moment at which I come to a verdict, a judgment, that's the judgment. And that's what informs my choice. That's not just true about little petty things like how am I going to spend my afternoon? It's true about the big picture things like what is happiness? What is a flourishing human life? And how do I achieve it? Those really big picture things. Well, When I was younger, I might have thought happiness was X, Y, and Z. Now that I'm older, I think it's A, B, and C. Over time, that can change. And it's because the intellect can see the good in different ways that we can will different things over time being the key thing, I think. For Scotus, no, that's not enough. That's not enough. What we need is not just diachronic contingency, but synchronic contingency. So Scotus is very emphatic about the idea that at the very moment of choice, I can choose otherwise than I do. And not to use their terminology, but to use ours, that is clearly not a de dicto possibility, that is a de re possibility. So a de dicto possibility would say that the following is possible. I choose X at T and I don't choose X at T. That's obviously not possible. That's a contradiction. Scotus says, I'm not saying that, obviously. Even God can't manage that, right? Even God can't manage contradictory wills. I would say at the same time, but Scotus' God, of course, is not in time. But here's what I can manage. At the very time at which I choose X, I have the possibility, right? I, the thing, hence de re possibility. I, the thing, have the possibility, which I don't actualize, of choosing not X or choosing the opposite of X. Without that kind of synchronic contingency, Scotus thinks we don't have genuine freedom. And by genuine freedom, he means, of course, libertarian freedom, though he doesn't have the terminology.
Right.
Yeah.
And I should say, because this will probably come up later if it doesn't come up now, those are the two things about freedom that Scotus is consistent on through his whole career. The idea that freedom is rooted in the will, not in the intellect, and the idea that freedom requires synchronic contingency and not merely diachronic contingency. There are other things in his views that are a bit unstable and that he revises, but those two things are constants.
Yeah. So that's a really nice way of setting up Aquinas versus Scotus. So what problem does Scotus see in Aquinas' view that makes him want to have a different conception of free will?
It's intellectual determinism, to put it shortly. For Scotus, the intellect kind of takes the inputs that it gets and it goes a certain direction and can't go otherwise given the circumstances and other possible inputs. So you might think if I've developed a lifetime of very conscientious habits, it's really not possible for my intellect to judge otherwise than it does, right? I might entertain the thought of getting out on the lake, but I won't really take it seriously because I'm a conscientious sort of person, for example. And so the idea is that the intellect kind of takes what is given and does its thing. I gave this principle a nickname in a graduate seminar. It's kind of stuck with me, though it's not in print anywhere. I call it the stomach principle. There are two kinds of things for Scotus. There are stomachs and wills. Stomachs, which is everything other than wills, just take what you throw in them and do their thing, right? So if I eat a certain kind of food, my stomach doesn't have any choice about what kind of enzymes it throws at it or how it processes it. It just does its thing. And it does it, so to speak, to the best of its ability. It can't be more or less restrained or more or less intense in what it does. It always acts up to the limit of its power, Scotus says. And that is the way everything other than a will works, including that's how an intellect works. And so if that's right, and the intellect is the root of freedom, there is no freedom. There's just intellectual determinism. Now, there are all kinds of ways for a Thomist to deny that that's what's going on. But for Scotus, at least, that is the clear problem. And so you need something about the will that can let the will say, I don't care what the intellect's final judgment was. I get to choose, and I choose something else. Or I refrain from choosing altogether. And that's really the fundamental disagreement with Aquinas, or at least how Scotus reads Aquinas and maybe Dominicans more generally. There is a bit of an influence at some point in talking about Scotus. Everybody has to say something about the condemnation of 1277. It's practically required by the medieval guild. So if you don't know about the condemnation of 1277, it was, conveniently enough, a condemnation that was issued in 1277 by the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier, who had heard some nasty rumors about overly Aristotelian teachings happening in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Paris, including a number of statements or propositions that seemed to imply intellectual determinism. And so they were, the Paris arts masters, or masters generally, were forbidden to teach these propositions. There were 219 of them about all kinds of random subjects, and seemingly in no particular order. Henry of Ghent, Scotus's bête noire, was, I think, the head of the commission that put those together, for what it's worth. But certainly there was an impetus in the condemnation of 1277 to get away from anything that looked remotely like intellectual determinism. Now, it is very, I think, important to remember that despite the fact that all of these people were priests and that this was a bishop, a successor of the apostles, issuing this condemnation, medieval faculty were just like present-day faculty. They don't want some administrator telling them what they can and cannot teach. So it's not like everybody just said, oh, well, okay, I was an intellectual determinist up until last Thursday, but the bishop said I can't be that anymore. That's not at all how it happened. So we can't suggest that somehow the condemnation made that sort of change. But the Franciscans were sort of going that direction anyway. They were very sympathetic to this. And I think it did give an impetus to people like Scotus to root freedom more firmly in the will again than in the intellect. So really the big worry is intellectual determinism.
Yeah.
Well, as you say in your chapter on Jon Duns Scotus in the Routledge Companion to Free Will, Scotus draws from Aristotle in his account of rational and non-rational powers. Since this is important for understanding what Scotus says about the scope of the will's freedom, could you explain what he means in saying that rational powers are powers for opposites and how these differ from non-rational powers?
So his ultimate conclusion is going to be that the will is the only rational power. He professes to take this from Aristotle, who, of course, had no conception of will as the medievals did. So he's really busting a move here interpretively, but that's okay. So Aristotle's idea is that rational powers are open to opposites and non-rational powers are not. So on Scotus's view, the only power that's genuinely open to opposites is the will. Because although the intellect is open to opposites over the course of time, right? There's diachronic contingency. It's not open to opposites at the moment of making a judgment or drawing an inference. It just takes what is given and does what an intellect does. So your intellect, just like your stomach, does what it does to the full extent of its power, is not genuinely open to opposites, whereas the will genuinely is. So it will turn out that the will is the only rational power. It's the only power that is genuinely open to opposites in the important sense of being characterized by synchronic contingency, not merely diachronic contingency. And that is, so he makes that argument in his commentary on the Metaphysics, book 9, question 15, one of the few references to Scotus that I know off the top of my head. That reference, or that work, is relatively late in his career, or at least he was revising it relatively late. He probably started that work early-ish, but he was still revising it pretty late, we know. And I think it's important because that is, despite the fact that he wrote it, or at least revised it pretty late, that is, as I've said, one of the constants in his thinking. So taking it from Aristotle and using the distinction between rational and non-rational powers might have been a kind of a new move. But the conclusion was one that he was already embracing long before. Now, one thing I think is very much worth saying about the idea that the will is a rational power is that some people have used that to argue against people like me, who see in Scotus kind of untrammeled or nearly untrammeled libertarian freedom. Now, of course, I want to see that because I think that's actually just true. But, not everything Scotus says is true. Everybody makes mistakes somewhere. Right. So they have tried to use this. Well, look, the will is a rational power. That means that the will doesn't function arbitrarily or randomly. It means that the will has reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds lovely, but it's not what SCOTUS means. I'm very explicit about that. To call the will a rational power just is to say that the will is open to opposites. And not just opposites over time, but opposites at the time of choice. That, if anything, suggests that it isn't rational in the sense of being reasons responsive, which is what people desperately, well, certain kind of people who are not giddy in their libertarianism the way I am, they want some assurance that Scotus's will doesn't just haul off and choose things. But to call it a rational power for him just is to say, yeah, it just hauls off and chooses things. He even says in that very question, you can't ask why the will wills. It just does. That's what wills do, right? Why does heat heat? Well, definitionally, that's just what heat does. It's a brute fact. Why do wills will? And not why do they will, but why do they will this thing rather than the other thing? They just do. That's just wills for you. That seems to me to be right, unfortunately. So if you put it in more contemporary terms, because you said something about the scope of free will. Peter Van Inwagen's, I think, fairly well-known paper, When is the Will Free, argues for what I believe he calls there, but I know I've heard him call at least, a state occasions view of freedom, which is freedom, like free choices only happen for big decisions. Like, right. I am faced with a clear choice between advantage on the one hand and morality on the other hand. Or I come to a crossroads in my life and I have to decide, do I want to be a professor or, I don't know, a church musician? I mean, that's a bad example. I'm not anywhere near talented enough to be a church musician, but suppose, okay. Those kinds of big occasions maybe would call for the exercise of free choice, but ordinary decisions don't. So that would be a state occasions view, which is PVI's view. And then there is, and this view does not have a name, but I know I've heard him at least say, on some people's view, we have gobs and gobs of freedom. And so I just call it the gobs view. Right. And the gobs view is, any choice worthy of the name choice is a free choice. Well, Scotus is clearly a gobs theorist. He clearly thinks we have gobs and gobs of freedom. Now, we can qualify that just a little bit by saying a point that I've never seen anybody make in the literature, though I will make it if I ever get this book written. And that is, Scotus is very clear that by and large, we do choose as our natural intellectual appetite would have us choose. That is, we do by and large tend to choose in terms of what we think will make us happy. It's just that we don't have to. So if you wanted a rough and ready explanation of why we do what we do, because we think that will make us happy, will generally be available. Mm-hmm. It's just that it's not, as it would be for Aquinas, the only possible available choice. So he doesn't in fact think that we are kind of blank slates or that we don't have natures or interests. He doesn't think that we come at every choice completely blank. I'm 58 years old. I've had a lifetime of making choices and forming a character for good or ill. And that's going to play a huge role in the way I behave. But it's not ever going to determine the way I behave. That includes any virtues as well as vices, but we won't talk about those. Any virtues that I might have. Scotus is very emphatic. I can always act against a virtue. Virtues don't necessitate right action. They make it a lot easier and a lot more pleasant, but they don't necessitate it. Because what does necessitate a free choice? Nothing, because it's a free choice. So we do have gobs and gobs of freedom.
Yeah.
On Scotus's view, which I think is right.
Well, in our discussion on Anselm, there was these two distinct and fundamental inclinations of the will, an affection for the advantageous and an affection for justice. Does Scotus share this view of the two inclinations of the will?
That turns out to be a really, really complicated question. right now, if you were to read the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Scotus, which is mine, you would read various false things in answer to that question. I hope that by the time this episode goes out, I will have corrected it, because the truth is that almost everybody has been massively wrong about the two affections. And I am by no means exempt from that condemnation. So the one, to my mind, generally reliable paper on this is by Peter King. If you look up Peter King's website, you'll be able to see from the title, it's something about Anselmianism. And Peter's basic idea, which I think is right, though I would have a lot more to say about it, is this. Scotus starts off being Anselmian, and by the end of his career isn't so much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So this seems to me absolutely right, unfortunately. Unfortunately, because it means I've been wrong in print over the course of 30 years. But, you know, so has everybody but Peter King. I'll just say briefly how I read Anselm, which is not quite the consensus reading, but it's the most common reading of the two affections. The idea for Anselm seems to be that we explain the fact that we're free. He puts it in terms of the angels, but it's obviously meant to apply to us. We're free because we have two different fundamental motivations. We have the motivation to choose what we take to be just, and we have the motivation to choose what we take will make for our happiness, will either constitute our happiness or contribute to our happiness. So those are the affection for justice and the affection for the advantageous, or the affection for advantage. Some writers will call it the affection for happiness or the affection for benefit. And it's because we have those two affections that could potentially lead us in different ways that we can choose, or at least in certain situations of choice, we can choose either advantage or justice. So this is very much a Peter van den Wagenstate occasions view. And so we've got the angels making their primal choice. It's a big deal. Mm-hmm. Right? Their eternal welfare depends on which choice they make. Anselm's not interested in whether I get out on the lake. He's just not, because does it matter for my going to heaven? I mean, maybe if I'm a Benedictine and my abbot says don't get out on the lake and I do it anyway, then possibly I'm going to hell. But in general, no, we just care about salvation. Scotus is not a state occasions theorist. He's a Gobbs theorist. So he's going to read this a little bit differently. But here's what Scotus will do with the two affections kind of early in his career. He will suggest, in something like Anselm's way, though the details are not all very Anselmian, that it's the fact that we have an affection for justice that sort of grants us our freedom, right? If we just had the affection for the advantageous, we wouldn't be free. Why? Because the affection for the advantageous is the affection for whatever the intellect presents to us as good or happiness conducive. And, well, we've already seen he's worried about intellectual determinism. So if the affection for the advantageous is just, in the medieval terms, intellectual appetite, right? The appetitive arm of the intellectual soul, then we're not free. How do we get to be free? Well, there's this other bit, this other module in the will that can temper or check or restrain or moderate intellectual appetite. And because we have that freedom, we don't have to will what intellectual appetite tells us to will. And we don't have to will it as intensely, so that we're not stomachs anymore, we're wills. And that's kind of what he says at the beginning. By the end of his career, he has cast that aside. And now the two affections survive in name only. And not everybody agrees with Peter on this, but I do. I would actually even go a little bit further. But since my bit's not out there in the world yet, we'll go with his. The idea is, by the end, he has the words affection for justice and affection for advantageous, but he doesn't actually have the things. They've been metaphysically demoted. Yeah. They are no longer modules or aspects or motivations or anything. They're just both the will itself, regarded in different ways. So if we talk about the affection for the advantageous, we're just talking about the will as intellectual appetite. And if we're talking about the affection for justice, we're just talking about the will as free. Now, how many wills do we have? One. How many motivations, modules, metaphysical bits does the will have? It's just a thing. It's just one thing. So that he says very explicitly, the two affections are not like extra bits added onto the will. They're not. When we talk about them, we're just talking about the will in two different ways. So notice, and certainly my own earlier work has not been, I'm being charitable to myself, has not been as clear as I would like about this fact. The will is still intellectual appetite. It is still the appetitive arm of the intellectual soul. It is our capacity for choosing what the intellect presents to us as good, where good has a kind of tie-in with happiness.
Mm-hmm.
What's different about Scotus from Aquinas is that Scotus insists it's not just that. So it's no less than intellectual appetite. It's more than intellectual appetite because it also has this element of freedom, which is irreducible and basic and brute. And so it's not constructed out of the two affections, as Anselm suggests, and as he suggests in some of his earlier work. It's just a fact about the will. And if you want to talk about the two affections, because we're Franciscans and we kind of like Anselm and two of the guys who ended up being influential in his career and put him up for promotion had talked about the two affections. I mean, he has some reasons, right? Like his peeps were kind of into Anselm, but he gradually kind of moves away from it and says, yeah, I'll use the words. Just don't make me believe in the things.
Right. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. Well, we've already touched on this some, but I wanted to ask more about the scope of the will's freedom on Scotus's view. So it's the Gobb's view. It's a very wide scope. Do you have anything more to say about the scope of freedom on his view? And then I'm curious what implications you think that has for his views on other topics.
I suppose the question about the freedom of the blessed in heaven is worth touching on, although this is not something I've thought about much at all. But the view seems to be that even in heaven, even enjoying the immediate vision of God, whatever exactly that comes to, I mean, we can't look at God as he is in himself and say, screw that, that's awful. But we can say, nah. So we can't, in their terminology, will against it, but we can not will it. We can fail to will it or refrain from willing it. So, and why can't we will against it? Because there's no aspect of badness in it. There's nothing to make us hate it. But we could always just say, you know what? I'd rather think about myself because I'm pretty awesome. This God person is super demanding. So, nah. Why don't we do that? Well, because God basically permanently interferes with the will. Because the will by its very nature is free, and God doesn't want us wandering off on our own in heaven. So he just keeps us from doing that. So that gives you an idea of how broad the scope of the will is.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
As far as what implications it has for other aspects of his views, I've touched on, I think, one of the most important ones, which is that for Scotus, virtues are not sufficient for right action. They're also not necessary for right action because obviously we can always just haul off and will the right thing, whether we have a virtue for it or not. So the freedom of the will has a tendency to demote the virtues. They're just not as important to Scotus. That doesn't mean they're not going to get a whole chapter in my book, but it's not going to be the crucial chapter that it would be, say, in a book on Aquinas' ethics, where the virtues do an awful lot of work. The virtues for Scotus, they're nice because they do enable us to act readily, reliably, and with pleasure. But so it's better to do the right thing and enjoy it than it is to do the right thing with white knuckles and gritted teeth. And a well-lived human life is going to be one in which we don't merely act righteously, but act righteously with love for God and joy in our hearts. I mean, we are Franciscans here after all, but we can still do the right thing even if we don't feel like it. And we can also feel like it and just say, screw it, this time I'm rejecting what I would do out of the virtue of temperance or whatever. And I haven't figured this out yet myself, but this may be connected with his Gobb's view about freedom. And that is, for Scotus, even the standard virtues, so take the virtue of temperance since I just mentioned it, temperance for him is not a unitary thing. There really is no virtue of temperance. There are many or micro temperances. And there he just says, look, you can easily imagine someone, maybe you can look in the mirror at someone who is quite temperate with respect to drink, but intemperate with respect to chocolate, or quite temperate with respect to sexual intercourse, but intemperate with respect to some other aspect of the pleasures of touch, which is the domain of temperance, or with respect to pleasure more generally. That's just a fact. Well, I mean, why is that? Well, it's in part, I guess, because the will remains free. And so it's not like there's this package deal where I acquire temperance and then everything that has to do with pleasure, I'm good to go. It just doesn't work that way. Scotus doesn't suggest, he says outright, that we should think of the virtues the way we think of the senses. So my eyesight is very, very poor. My hearing is very, very good. There's nothing remotely strange about that. We don't think, well, I mean, look, if your hearing is good, your eyesight must also be good. No, they're different modules. Same thing with the virtues, right? They're different bits. So,
yeah.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Scotus claims that freedom is a brute fact, and yet we've just been talking about the two affections of the will. Seems to be some kind of explanation of freedom. How do scholars interpret Scotus in light of this tension, and what's your view of the best interpretation of Scotus?
You rarely see, in fact, off the top of my head, I can't think of any example. You rarely see scholars actually noticing this. The first time I noticed it, I was semi-panicked because Scotus so clearly says in that classic place in the Questions of the Metaphysics and elsewhere, look, the will is just the will. It wills because that's what wills do. Don't ask any questions. It is the mark of the indisciplinatus, the inadequately trained, even to ask such questions. And so you've got that on the one side. And then on the other side, you've got, oh, and by the way, we're free because of this one fact about the will, not because of the will itself. Those are obviously contradictory. And my suspicion is that part of the reason he moves away from Anselmianism is that he realizes, A, he doesn't need it, because you can just root freedom in the will as will. And B, he's not entitled to it because his own view is that there is no explanation for the freedom of the will. And Anselm had a different view. And his Franciscan forebears, like John of Moravale, probably the most important one, kind of were Anselmian in ways that Scotus just wasn't. And so as he kind of works through his own understanding of the bruteness of the will's freedom, he realizes it's not just that he can jettison Anselm, he has to jettison Anselm for the sake of consistency. Now, all of this, of course, is speculation. He doesn't, he doesn't put an article in whatever the 13th century equivalent of Phil Review was, correcting his own earlier work. He just changes it, but the revisions clearly track in a particular direction. And so by the end of his career, he's very consistent in his sentences, commentaries, and in the Questions on the Metaphysics. Look, freedom is just brute. There is no explanation. We can think about the will in more than one way, but there are no affections in the will that are, in his terminology, different in re, that is in any way metaphysically distinct from the will. They're just the will. So I think there absolutely is a tension, and at least on a charitable reading, it's one that he recognizes and deals with by jettisoning the offending claim, which is that there's an explanation for the will's freedom beyond just the will is the will.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Well, thank you, Thomas, so much for joining us. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
I'm fairly reliable about posting new stuff on my website, which is profthomaswilliams.com. And I hope that there will be a book out on SCOTUS before too long, but certainly by the time this podcast episode goes out, there will be a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on SCOTUS that will say only true things. Something that cannot currently be said about the SEP article on SCOTUS. So that would be another place to go.
Nice. Yeah. We'll link both of those in the show notes. That's great.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, Thomas.
Thanks, guys.
This concludes Season 11 of The Free Will Show. We'll be back in the new year with Season 12, which will be a grab bag of assorted topics.